Is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, Labor is supporting this bill. It's and that is a change in position from the first reading of the bill. We think it has been improved in the Select Committee, and it's sort of gone from being a 55-45 decision one way to a 60-40 one the other. So it's one which we will debate through the House, but one which, unless there are any further amendments from the Minister which we disagree with, we will support as we progress. We think that the changes, especially the improvements around the vetting that have occurred, the changes that came to the committee on the question of home-based care and the very real danger of people who are not responsible for children but living in homes where there is home-based care occurring. It is a gap in the legislation, and a gap which I'm happy to acknowledge as a minister who was involved in a lot of the development of this bill, of this legislation back in the early 2000s. There's always a very fine balance when it comes to working out what are the limits that you're prepared to go to protect children. You want to make sure that as far as is possible, everything reasonable is done, but no one wants to get tied up so much in a bureaucracy that schools can't get on with doing what they want to do, and that people can't be involved with their schools, with their children in schools as parent helps and similar type arrangements. You always want them to be involved if you can, and I think the test that we've got to in this legislation around having charge of children and children not having not being alone with children without getting a vet is about right. And I might say I think the world has changed a lot certainly in the 30 odd years or bit longer than that now, since I was in a classroom with bit longer than that when I was with primary school age children, because our practices were very different at that stage. I mean, I can remember teaching at South Wellington Intermediate with Form 2 kids, and we had a store cupboard at the back of the room, as many classrooms did and still do, and that is where I did remedial reading with both boys and girls on their own with the door shut to stop them being embarrassed by their inability to read. And that was, no one ever challenged the practice at that stage. I tend to say that these days it is something that was unlikely to be done and would be seen to be inappropriate. So I think there are sorry? Well, I mean, store cupboard's probably the wrong word for it, but it had a wee table in it. It had books around the outside. It was a room that was probably 2 metres, still room. Thank you. Still 2 metres by 3 metres, something like that. So it wasn't a broom cupboard, but it was something. The point that I'm trying to make, it was something where there was no line of sight from outside that room into the room, and what I'm saying is that my judgment at that time, the judgment I think of most teachers at the time, was that it was better to protect kids of 11, 12 and 13 from the embarrassment about their lack of reading skills, from being laughed at by some of the other kids, and didn't contemplate the questions which might arise. So I think that those times have changed, I suppose it is the best thing, but I'm not quite sure if society's changed in the right way because of the assumptions that occur. Most of the amendments in this legislation are those which were in the bill that the minister's predecessor introduced in September 2008. I think it was called the Education Amendment Bill number 3. There were some changes that she made in some areas that have been added and some areas have been left out. I think the question of getting the data matching between the Teachers' Council and the Ministry of Education is something which is very important. It's, I think there was probably an assumption again at the time that the legislation was introduced that it could be done automatically. I think we thought that there wouldn't be a restriction on it. No doubt someone from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner or God bless Marie Schroff, but someone can sometimes be slightly sort of overzealous in that area. But there is no doubt that getting that information matching will help both ways. It will help with the Ministry of Education, making sure that they are getting the right people, and it will also help identify people who are in schools that are not currently registered, and that in most cases won't matter very much, but there are likely to be some individuals there who shouldn't be in the schools, and this is a good way, without having much cost at all, other than the setting up of the system, to make sure this occurs. The idea that it might take more than 3 months after the suspension of a teacher's practising certificate to sort a case through is one where I think there is general acceptance, and the ability of the Teachers' Council to extend a suspension for another 3 months as a case is worked through, I think is one which is where there's quite a lot of support for. There was one area, I think it was an interesting period at the Select Committee, and I think an education for some of the newer members of Parliament as they watched MMP at work when an unusual coalition developed between the Green Party, who I must say it was sort of, even I think for Catherine Delahunty, who was a new member at the time, it was an interesting exercise for her, learning a little bit of the art of compromise and working through the system, because she found it pretty hard, as she did in the end, to vote with the ACT Party in order to get an amendment to the bill, which was not supported. The amendment was supported by Labour and the Greens and by ACT, but not by the National Party, who were promoting the bill. And what that amendment did was effectively put us in a position for commissioners and other statutory managers of schools similar to that of receivers in companies which are under statutory management, whereby there is an individual or sometimes two individuals who are responsible for that. It's people on whom fingers can be put, direct contacts can be made, people who are responsible, rather than having, as was proposed by the Minister, a fairly bland and broad corporate in charge. And I think unreasonably, the Greens and maybe even some of my colleagues saw some dangers of privatisation out of that route. And I just sort of say to people, I think there was a relatively long bow being drawn, and I didn't mind getting a Green vote because of that concern. I think it was probably something I wasn't that anxious about, but what I would be anxious about, and will be anxious about again, will be the ability as Minister of Education to pick up the phone and to ring an individual and say to that individual, you are the person who I've appointed Commissioner of this school, I want a report from you, I want your view on this, and I wouldn't want to ring the switchboard at Price Waterhouse and try and work my way through the system after that. And that is the reason that I promoted what I think is a bit of a compromise in order to get that to happen. I think the one area of concern I'll have, and we'll get to it at later stages of the bill, is that a section which was in the original legislation around the responsibility of boards is not in this legislation, and I think it would have been good for that to have occurred, and we will get back to that. But as I indicated, we don't think this is going to make an enormous difference